a gun in the face.
Then all of a sudden, they all kind of lined up. They pointed their guns at me. And this is the point where I thought, I'm going to die today.
Started 2 years of horror for an American in Venezuela.
They said, you need to give us your phone and get ready because you're coming with us.
I'm Becky Bruce, and I spent a year researching and piecing together Josh and Tammy Holt's story about their ordeal in a notorious prison.
That's when everything started to turn bad. We had another pound on the door. Boom, boom, boom. And there was the police once again.
You can binge all of the episodes of Hope in Darkness on KSLpodcasts.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
In today's episode of Project Recovery, my 13-year-old son has said on 2 separate occasions that he wanted to commit suicide. But he laughs and plays with his friends and excels in sports and academics. So I shrug it off. I'm searching for help now. You may have saved my son's life.
Wow.
Make sure you listen to the end. Find us on Facebook at Project Recovery. We'll have that and much more coming up. Hey, welcome to Project Recovery, a podcast about addiction. More importantly, it's about recovery. And it's brought to you by our friends at useonlyasdirected.org. They got a 3-part solution to the opioid epidemic: speak out, opt out, and of course, throw out. I'm Casey Scott.
Hey, I'm Dr. Matt Woolley.
Hey, so right before we get going, you said something, and then we had a total disagreement. And normally, we don't disagree on a lot of things.
True.
You said, can't stop, won't stop.
Yeah.
And then I said, Miley Cyrus.
And I said,
Beastie Boys.
Beastie Boys. Come on.
Which, to be fair, they're both accurate. But I think
Are
most...
they? I wouldn't know. I don't know that I could name a Miley Cyrus song.
I'm telling you, Can't Stop, Won't Stop by Miley Cyrus, it's a banger. And that's what the kids say when it's like a good song in the club. They go, oh, this song is a banger.
All right. Well, you're a DJ. You need to know all that
And
stuff.
I'm telling you right now, because
You have to play lousy music for the people that want to hear it.
you say lousy, I say pop. And you know what pop is short for? Popular.
It is very popular.
And so the crazy
That
thing
doesn't
is...
necessarily validate it.
No, it doesn't. But I'm 47, and I've been DJing a lot of weddings. And
But do you like listening to that? I've actually always, this is funny, because I've always wanted to ask you this, and for some reason I never have. It's really not that important. But do you like listening to most of the music that you play, like that kind of stuff, that kind of trashy pop music that everyone loves to dance to? Because I get it. I've been at those parties, and it is fun to dance to that. But, like, I would never want to listen to something like Miley Cyrus. Throw me a Beastie Boys record anytime, and I would love that.
just the other day, I was jamming to Miley Cyrus on the elliptical.
Yeah?
I mean, call me
So you
old.
that's okay.
But I like it.
I
But
was
you
just
know,
curious if it grew on you because you had to listen
I
to
think
it.
what I enjoy
Yeah.
is making people have a good time. And so
There
when
you
I'm
go.
sitting there and I'm DJing and my girlfriend's there or my kids are there and I go, watch this. And I know if I put this song on,
Yeah,
I'm going to get people out there dancing and they're going to have a good time. And that's what I really enjoy. I have a very eclectic palette when it comes to music.
Yeah, you do. More than I do,
Yeah,
for sure.
and I like to sample a little bit of everything. And so I just really like to music speaks to me. So this is an honest conversation that me and my son had.
Okay.
And Bowden, he's got this very inquisitive mind. And he always comes up with these like, would you rather type questions. And he was like, so Dad, I go, yes, son. It's my favorite thing in the world. He always goes, hey, Dad. He says it probably 30 times a day. Hey, Dad. And I was like, yes, son. And he goes, would you rather be blind or deaf?
Oh.
And I said, I would rather be blind. And he goes, why? I said, because if I was deaf, I couldn't hear the music.
Okay.
And
yeah,
music,
that's a really honest answer.
music really is something that's been instrumental to my recovery. It's provided for my family, and I find consolation in it all the time, and I find optimism, and to me, music really speaks to the heart.
Yeah.
and that's what really gets me going.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
And I would say I have several friends that are professional musicians, and it's interesting to me that even though they may kind of make their living in one genre of music, somebody who's really a music person, where music really speaks to them, they tend to have an eclectic interest in music, and they like lots of different kinds of of music. And I think that's because you experience lots of different emotions, and it does different things for you, and it's creative, it's explorative. And so, yeah, it makes sense to me that you would have that feeling. Plus, as a performer, and a DJ is a performer, you're playing the room. Like you said, you can put on a certain song and change the whole mood and tempo, and you're kind of connecting with everybody that's out there on the dance floor.
I really like to find the sweet spot. Like if you go, is this going to be a 70s crowd? Is this going to be an 80s crowd? Are we going to be playing some heavy metal? And then once you find it, you just ride that. And,
and when I've
going.
been there with you, you've explained to me, like, we're going to take them down this route with these songs, and then we're going to switch and do this.
Yeah.
And so you kind of keep the energy going throughout the night. And I think that's really cool. I don't have that creative gene, to be able to do those things, but it's pretty cool to watch people like yourself do that.
Hey, guess what I'm not doing anymore?
What's that?
Blowing.
Yeah.
Woo!
Congratulations. Finally over.
Graduate of the 24/7 program. And
Yeah.
I know I speak about this a lot, but the 24/7 program. So here's the deal. A year ago, I just celebrated my 1-year anniversary of sobriety.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I wasn't sure because I didn't think I was going to get there. I mean,
Didn't?
I didn't think. Well, I mean, that was the goal and that was the hopes.
Yeah.
But it just seemed so far away. And then all of a sudden, I got there, and I was like, now what?
Well, for a guy who's been drinking pretty regularly since
14?
junior high,
Yeah.
That's a big accomplishment.
A big part of my life. And so I got to that year of sobriety, and then I was able to get in this 24/7 program.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who don't know, I talk about it quite a bit. The 24/7 program is 365 days, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I go down between 6:30 and 8:30 in the morning, and I blow for an officer to show that there's no alcohol in my breath, and I go in the evening from 6:30 to 8:30. Now, I've been there every day for 365 days.
Right.
I went New Year's, I went Christmas, I went Easter, I went my
No holidays off.
during the pandemic, when you're not supposed to breathe, I was down there breathing and blowing into this thing.
And when people are going out of town and going camping, you can't do any of that because you're down there twice a day.
To be honest, I've been handcuffed to Ogden for the past year.
Yeah.
And I don't mind. And it was something that I put myself into. I put myself back on probation to get into this program, to do this, to be able to have a license to provide for my family.
Right.
Now, the thing I found about this, there's a lot of recovery centers out there. Mm-hmm. This, by far, has been one of the most rewarding and most awesome recovery programs I've been a part of because it holds you accountable. Had I come in and had liquor on my breath, I'd have spent 8 hours in jail. Second time, 12 hours. Third time, 24 hours. Fourth time, they kick you out of the program.
Yeah.
I never had a hiccup, never had anything. But what it did is it provided me the ability to live my life and still hold myself accountable.
I think it's I think it's a genius program, honestly, from a psychological point of view, because it includes two types of reinforcement. And reinforcement in the psychology world is when something happens that increases or decreases our behavior, right? Mm-hmm. And so you were hurting that year that you were waiting to get your license back. It was hard to get a job. You're riding the kiddie bike down to the Smiths to get groceries and all that kind of stuff.
I was walking to the train.
Can't get a job that requires you to have a car. And so the positive reinforcement is tremendous. If I go down, or anybody goes down and blows twice a day, then I get to have this license. I get to have my life back. So the positive reinforcement is huge. Plus, there's also what's called positive punishment, meaning they'll give you a punishment, which is 8 hours in jail if you blow dirty, right? And so you want to avoid that punishment, but you have a positive reinforcement that outweighs the punishment because that's so important to a person's life. I think it's genius, and I wish that was available to everybody everywhere.
Well, they're trying to take it statewide, but the interesting thing is that I became friends with a lot of these people in the program. There's usually about anywhere from 20 to 40 of us in there, and I see a lot of these people more than I see my best friends.
Yeah.
I mean, I've have relationships with these people, and we talk. I've got nicknames for everybody,
Right.
and it's really cool. But it's interesting to see that, about 6 months into the program, I'm talking to somebody, and I'm like, hey, how are things going? He goes, actually really well. And I was like, well, what are you talking about? And he goes, well, I've lost a lot of weight. My relationship with my wife is a lot better. My kids are happier. And so they're seeing these benefits of these program, and it's just because that they're doing this program that they're not allowed to drink.
Right.
But they're also being able to have a good time and realize that they don't need alcohol to celebrate, to have a good time.
Yep.
Now, there's a flip side of that coin where there's a couple people in there where they go, it was my birthday. I was going to go out and drink, and so I spent 8 hours in jail.
Oh,
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
He goes, I'm just going to do it. But at least he was honest. He was honest with the officers, and he goes, hey, look, I got alcohol in my breath. I haven't slept for 2 days. I'm ready to go,
Yeah.
And they're willing to take those consequences.
Yeah.
But there's a couple people that be like, yeah, as soon as this is done, we're going to the bar. And I go, I don't know if that's a good idea.
Yeah. Well, I would love to look at the statistics. I hope they're keeping stats on this program so that it can go, statewide, because my guess is those people are in the minority, and that positive reinforcement of any behavior for an entire year is going to start solidifying that that's who you are now. And so if you do that for a whole year and you're getting rewarded for a whole year for doing something healthy and good for yourself, and you're like the guy who's recognizing that it's better for his health, it's better for his relationships, it's better for his work, after the end of the year, hopefully most people, and I think the stats would prove it, are kind of like, I love this. This is my new me.
The transformation.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a transformation that occurs.
Yeah.
And whether you know it, I mean, but you go up and down. And
I mean, they talk about a habit, it depends on what you read, but, 3 or 4 weeks of doing something every day generally creates a habit. You just did it for a whole year.
And I never thought that year would come.
Yeah.
And so here I am now 2 years sober.
2 years,
and, and now I've got this whole world out in front of me. Yeah. And I'm not going to lie to you. I feel invincible.
Well, you should, and I think it's cool. Another thing is you made a little community, and by the way, for the listeners, Casey does that everywhere he goes. He makes friends with everybody.
I try to.
Everyone has a nickname, and you kind of have to not want to be Casey's friend, otherwise you'll end up
And
his
if
friend.
you don't want to be my friend, I'll work
But
harder
isn't
to
that
make
fun?
you.
Because you've said that to me before, like the nicknames you've given people and they've given you. What do they? One girl calls you Smiles or Chuckles or
Chuckles.
Yeah,
and then I got a girl named Smokey Eyes, and some guy goes, "Hey, do you mind if I call her Smokey Eyes when you graduate?" And I go, "No, go ahead." And
Just pass it on.
Yeah, and so and then I just love it, and so I feel good.
But that's great because that's reinforcing too. And so, just as sort of a little bit of a side note, if you're listening and if you're in recovery, find yourself a community, and you might find several communities in unlikely places. Like, I bet a lot of people just go down there, don't say anything to anybody, blow, and leave.
Yeah. And
right?
so I've now become the ambassador for the program.
Oh, good.
So,
I'd love it if we could go advocate up on Capitol Hill for that.
Well, we're going to try to get him in here on the program, but one of the lieutenants goes, "Hey, do you mind if I give your number out?" Because a lot of people, when they first get in there the first 2 weeks, it just seems daunting. They feel overwhelmed, and you got to go through all this stuff. And you've had a good experience, so when you talk to them, I was like, "Yeah, give my number out."
That's
so
great.
I've talked to a couple of people and said, "Listen, yeah, it sucks, but it should suck." Because when I didn't have a license, my DUI sucked for everybody around my family.
Sure.
Because they had to take me to the store, they had to do this and that.
Right.
And now, don't get me wrong, the program is a pain in the ass. But it should be.
It sounds like it. But anything worthwhile tends to at least start out that way.
Yeah.
Going to the gym, studying in school, anything that you do that makes your life better over time is hard at first.
Yeah. So I want to say thank you to the Ogden City Police and the Sheriff's Department and everybody who helped me through this. And I really did learn a lot, and I will advocate for your program all the time. Hey, stick around because we're going to talk about last week's episode, and we're going to get into that because we didn't realize what a nerve we would touch when we did this.
The response has been tremendous, and I'm really grateful that people are paying attention to the episode and that they're sharing their feedback with us.
Yeah, it's National Suicide Prevention Month. We'll have more of that coming up on Project Recovery.
Two friends taking pictures of the rising full moon on a summer night.
Two teenage kids doing what teenage kids do.
When a stranger with a gun and a death wish changed everything.
It was violent, it was senseless, and I will never understand it, I will never accept it.
I'm Amy Donaldson, and unfortunately, we're all too familiar with stories about how violence shatters lives. But what we rarely see is how they are rebuilt. In a new podcast, The Letter, we relive tragedy, but only so we can hear the rest of the story. The struggle to reclaim lives, the realities of grief, and the possibilities of forgiveness.
I believe in miracles. Sometimes I thought, there are no miracles. Yeah, there are, and this is a big one.
Follow The Letter at theletterpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, welcome back to Project Recovery. I'm Casey Scott. That's Dr. Matt. Last week we had Josh on, and Josh lost his son, Brock, a little over a month ago to suicide.
To be honest, when I knew he was going to be our guest, I was worried because
Why?
because it's so fresh and raw, and I was hesitant to have him come on because I wanted to make sure that he felt like that's really where he was at and what he wanted to do. And it turns out he was. He was an excellent, I think, guest, and is still in the process of dealing with, that grief is going to go on, and he's just barely at the beginning of dealing with it. But I feel like coming on and telling the story and being able to try to influence others for good in this area of suicide and from a parent's perspective, I think that's added to his process of grieving in a positive way. But he was an excellent guest. But yeah, I was a little nervous because I work professionally with people that have trauma and loss. And a month after a traumatic event and a loss like that is usually not time for a person to feel like they can come on and talk.
I had the same reservations, and when Rob, offered him up as a guest, I was like, "Is he going to be okay?"
Yeah,
and he goes, "Yeah." I said, because the same thing. I said he's kind of raw and everything's new, and he goes, but he just feels like he wants to get that out.
Yeah.
And there's so many people in the recovery world that say, "Listen, if my story can just help one person,
right."
That's a success. Now, with that being said, we've got our Project Recovery Facebook page. We've got an Instagram. And we got a comment on our Facebook page. And it said, "This is the first episode talking about last week's where I'm in absolute tears. My 13-year-old son has said on 2 separate occasions that he wanted to commit suicide. But he laughs and plays with his friends and excels in sports and academics. So I shrug it off. I'm searching for help now. You may have saved my son's life."
Wow. That when I read that it makes you pause and think.
Because how many times have kids said that? Whether it's just an exaggeration,
Well, and that's Josh and Brock's story.
Yeah,
same thing.
And they'd even asked him and confronted him, and he shrugged it off.
Right.
And I know 2020 sucks, but the year and hindsight. But if you were to go back and push this further. Mm-hmm. The outcome could have been completely different. But how do you do that?
Yeah, and that's one of the most frustrating and difficult things for anybody involved in a suicide is to go back and kind of play the what if game. What if we have done something different? What I love about this message from our listener is that they are inspired to act differently and take more of an active role in working with their adolescent, I'm assuming because of listening to Josh's story. Because all the other things, listen to that. So many kids are doing well in school. They do have friends. They're laughing and joking, but there is something building inside that has to do with depression. It has to do with that change of mindset that comes when depression hits. Adolescence is a tumultuous time of emotional development and social development, and so we don't always know what's below the surface of an adolescent. And it also happens in adults, too. Mm-hmm. But teenagers are particularly difficult to read, and so I'm so glad that this listener was inspired to start to look for more help, meaning I hope that means more contact and serious conversation with their adolescent. I have teenagers and they like to joke around, and all your conversations are sort of superficial. You're talking about the snarky things they say and the music they listen to. And we often feel good about those conversations, but this person, and I hope other parents, will be inspired to carve out time to have more real life conversations with your teens, with your kids. In addition to that, it sounds like maybe this person will be looking for some support for their teen, somebody to go talk to. I think one of the biggest problems with the stigma of mental health and therapy is that we still hold on to this medical model, which is if something's broke, then I go into the doctor to get it fixed. Otherwise, I don't need the doctor.
Right.
But for an adolescent who's in the prime of their developmental time, their psychological, emotional, social development, when their identity is developing and they're trying to become who they are, that's a wonderful time for an adolescent to have an impartial person to talk things through with. There is insight that comes from talking through your internal thoughts and feelings. And as an adolescent, that's a perfect time to learn how to process and clarify and develop insight. And so we can help a kid avoid those impulsive suicidal behaviors if all along they're having maybe a counselor to talk with. There's nothing it's hard to convince people, I think. It's helpful to go in and see a counselor even if you don't feel like there's anything wrong with you. I talk to young couples about that. Like, who would be the best people for marriage therapy? People that have been married 20 years and are fighting, or people that have been married 20 minutes and want to have a great marriage? It's the latter, right? Like that's where you can make the best long-term impact. Is let's help grow together. Let's develop insight as a couple. Same thing for teenagers. You're learning about yourself. How do I deal with anxiety? How do I deal with depression? Life is going to rock you, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's just it rains on everybody. Some people are smart enough to get umbrellas. And so a counselor can help you learn how to develop those skills to deal with the rain when it comes, to deal with your depressions, your anxiety, and maybe more than anything, stress management. How stressful has this year been? Oh. You know, like I hate to give in to talking about it that way, but the reality is, for those of us here in Utah especially, we're dealing with a worldwide pandemic. Then we're dealing with major earthquakes. Now we're dealing around the world in the country with riots. And now we just had winds in northern Utah that are blowing everything down and wrecking homes and trees. And I mean, it just feels like, and now kids are not getting their outlets because they're at home instead of at school, and some sports are canceled, and everything's kind of weird and different. And almost every day I have several people tell me, I'm tired of this. I feel overwhelmed.
When is it going to stop?
Yeah.
And, you know, that brings me up to another point that we were talking about off air when we talked about Josh and Brock's story. You know, sometimes when something happens to these kids and they start to have suicidal thoughts, it's one little thing that sets them over. And the reality is there's a lot of things going on under the surface that we don't know about.
Right.
And so when that one thing happens, it's just like the hurricane winds on top of all the other stuff.
Well, and you mentioned something that I think happens way too often. I remember hearing these sorts of things when I was a teenager myself. If somebody attempted suicide but didn't complete suicide, so maybe they had an overdose or something like that, people sort of dismiss it, don't they?
It's just a cry for help. She's just crying for help. And they would kind of dismiss it like, you know, she's just being dramatic. You know, that's just what she does. And right now in 2020, I'm going, she's crying for help.
Yeah, so
give her the help.
Yeah,
don't dismiss it. Don't make her feel bad about her situation, and don't write it off. I don't care what she's crying for. She's crying for help.
Yes, and we should be giving that help. And I think we live in a culture or a situation that's more helpful than when you and I were teenagers. But we still have a long way to go. And one of the things is, building on what you're saying, we need to realize that. So let's just do a stereotypical example. Let's say a young teenage girl didn't get asked to a dance, or a boyfriend cheated on her by kissing somebody else or something like that, and then she attempts suicide and doesn't complete suicide, thankfully, and now people are starting to say, oh, she's just dramatic, she's just crying for help. But see, for an adolescent, we don't know what's underneath the surface. That negative social event is the straw that broke the camel's back. But to them, that was huge. That was very, very important. And we've probably missed all the stuff that's going on under the surface because for an adolescent, there's a lot of reward for being social, for going to school, for being with your friends. And so we sometimes look at those things and say, oh, underneath the surface, they must be fine because like this person said in their message, grades are good, friends are good, they're laughing, they're playing sports, they're involved. But we should never ever dismiss an event because we think it's trivial to us as adults. Because to that kid, it's probably A, extremely important in their life, and B, probably just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, you know, when I got divorced, I didn't divorce well. My ex-wife kicked my butt. She out-divorced the heck out of me.
What does that mean? What do you mean?
I mean, she just did everything right and I did everything wrong.
Okay.
But the only thing I did right, because I went through a divorce, when I was a kid, and my ex-wife never did. I said, the kids need to stay, if they can, in the same school. She says, why? I said, because to them, that's their world. I know as adults, we go, hey, that's you move to different schools, that's what happens, friends. You'll be all right.
Don't worry about it.
And a lot of times that can happen, but if we can help them and keep them in the same environment, that's going to be the best for them. Because I had a ninth grader, I had a sixth grader, and I had a third grader. All of a sudden, these guys go through parents being divorced and have to go to a new school. To them, that is their world being changed.
Right.
And so, I think we do. We trivialize some of the stuff that happens to our kids because experience has taught us that in the long run, those things really don't make that big of a difference. But in the moment, to those kids, that is everything.
It is, and it's sometimes hard as an adult to think back to what it was like to be a teenager and to have your friends be so important to you in your school and all of that. But you get an A+ on that because that's exactly right. That's what I would recommend. That's what we did in my divorce as well, is try, at least for a year or two, can you keep the kids in the same house? Can you keep them in the same neighborhood? Can you keep them in the same schools, the same church that they go to, scouts, whatever they do? Because the family changing is a big enough adjustment as well, and they'll rely on their friends and families. So that's really important for parents.
And I know that's not going to work for everyone's
situation. It doesn't.
I'm just
but
saying,
if you can sacrifice a little bit to make it happen, it pays dividends. One of the things I'm concerned about right now, though, is the effect of the pandemic and all the stress and changes on teenagers' lives. So
not only teenagers, young kids. I remember talking to somebody, and imagine being into first grade right now. This is the first time you go to all-day school, and this is the only world you know.
Right.
Masks, pandemic, everything you touch is going to kill you. The winds, the earthquakes. I mean, imagine what those little minds have on them every time they go to bed at night. I mean, they've got to be carrying the weight of the world, all the uncertainty that's going on right now. I mean, that is an overload. It's tough for me, and I'm old.
Yeah, we have that perspective of knowing, things come to an end, bad things eventually come to an end, and things change because we've lived long enough to have many of those experiences. But absolutely, for a little person just starting into school and being that young age, this is all they know, and they don't have that wisdom to know that things will change and go back to normal. And frankly, we're all kind of hoping. I mean, we don't know for sure because this is somewhat uncharted territory. But one of the things that I want to talk about is that very thing, that kids who we don't realize how important the outlets of school, sports, music lessons, these extracurricular things are in their lives for not just fun and social contact, but also their stress management. And they potentially come into contact with other adults that are good mentors and people that give them advice at the right time and suggestions and support. And so one of the things that's happened during this the pandemic time is the CDC has been continuing to gather data. And a recent 10,000 person study shows that about 11% of the people that responded seriously considered suicide between March and June. Whoa. But when you drop the age group to late teens, early 20s, it more than doubles to about 25% of the respondents seriously considering suicide. That's alarming, and also tells you that the younger the person is, it sounds like the more they're susceptible to having thoughts of suicide during these prolonged periods of stress. Most of the time, stress in a young person's life is short-term. Studying for a test that's coming
like
up,
a roller coaster, ups and downs.
Ups and downs. And actually, the value in that is it teaches them to learn to deal with stress in little sprints, and they develop the skills so that maybe when they get older, bigger, longer-term stresses, they're more prepared for. Well, now we're in this period of long-term stress, lots of uncertainty. We really don't know exactly when it's going to end. We don't even know what their school day is going to be like in December. We know it's weird now. Will it be the same? We don't know.
It's like recovery. We're taking it a day at a time.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's 24.
That's actually a pretty tall order sometimes to take it a day at a time, whatever your stress is. So it's important to keep in mind that kids are struggling perhaps a little bit more with the idea of I'm overwhelmed and I just sort of want out, which can transition into more specific suicidal thoughts. And that's what this study is showing, is that we have a dramatic increase in younger people feeling like suicide might be an option for them. And that really, really concerns me.
It's mind-blowing. Let's take a break. When we come back, more with Project Recovery, a KSL podcast. Hey, welcome back to Project Recovery. September is National Suicide Prevention Month. Last week we had Josh on talking about his son who he lost to suicide over a month ago. And during that interview, he said that there's a new number out, and he said it was 877. He did call me back and say the new number is 988. But the thing is, it's not up and running until like July 2022. Right. So that is something to look forward to. But right now, the number, if you need to call somebody and have somebody listen to you and talk to you, it's 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-8255.
Yeah. And that's the number to use. At some point in the next couple of years, I'm sure they'll roll out a big campaign to help us.
They want it to be like 911.
Yeah.
And so wherever you are, whenever you need somebody to talk to, you just hit 988 and somebody's going to be there and be able to listen to you.
Yeah. So we'll all as a country be made aware when that's up and running, I'm sure.
But we're talking about suicide prevention, and you just gave us some statistics that that jumped from 11% to 25%, and that was
based on ages.
Yes.
Right. So the younger people are maybe struggling more with suicidal thoughts during this pandemic than the older people.
And one thing we found out is when a suicide occurs, there's a likely phenomenon of more people committing them in that area.
Especially among youth. Yeah.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, there are several theories, so it's hard to know exactly. I think it has a lot to do with teenagers have kind of an emotional connection to each other in their school. There are lots of kids. I think it also speaks to the fact that there are a lot of kids that are kind of on the edge and we don't know it. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the theories I don't like is people say, oh, they see that they got attention for it, so I'm going to get attention for it. And there may be a little bit of truth in there, but it's sort of speaks to the fact that kids need a voice. If that kid who's been harboring suicidal thoughts and someone in their school commits suicide and then they decide, okay, I'm going to do it too, what does that teach us? That teaches us they needed to talk. They needed to get some things out way before this happened. We need to make sure as parents, as teachers, and as other people that work with kids that we aren't afraid to bring up questions. Now, you can ask somebody, are you suicidal? And I'll tell you what a teenager will think. They'll usually think, am I suicidal in this moment? That's the concreteness of how they'll take that. So it's okay to ask them that, but it might be better to say, recently, how have you been feeling? Open-ended question. And then you might say, well, sometimes we all get down. Have you had any specific thoughts, like thoughts of harming yourself recently, or even thoughts of not wanting to be here? Get them talking about that. And then don't be afraid to ask, have you ever thought about suicide? And oftentimes they'll backpedal and say, no. I say, well, it's different, to think about it versus make a plan.
Because I'll be honest with you, I've thought about it.
Well, when people are being honest, the reality is most people have thought of suicide at some point in their life. Now, most people, fortunately, don't formulate a plan. They don't go to that extent, but some people do. But a teenager, you need to talk to them and say, you know what, it's okay. And in fact, if you're ever talking to one of your kids, you could say to them what you just said to me, which is, I have to be honest, I've thought of it before. I've hit some low points in my life, and I've wondered maybe it'd be better if I wasn't here. Have you ever felt that way? And you start a conversation that way with your kids, especially if you know that they've been influenced by a suicide in their area. And unfortunately, recently, there was a live suicide by an individual on Facebook Live.
No,
with a gun. It was very violent, and that's been circulating. It's been talked about and circulated on places like TikTok and Facebook, and it's a horrible tragedy. And this goes beyond just perhaps a smaller community that's geography, like a school, and that this is now potentially a worldwide community that has access to watching this person take their life. And it's a horrible tragedy. I don't encourage people to go look up the video. I think it's enough to know what happened. And in fact, I had somebody ask me, do you want to see the video? What do you think I told them?
No.
Yeah, I told him no, and the reason is I've seen a few things in my life that were live, and I kind of vowed I'm never going to see those again. I don't mind telling people that I've obsessed a little bit about the death that I've seen in real life, and it's very disturbing. It's enough to know what happened. I don't think you need to see it, but that puts the conversation for real out there when something like that has happened. And to my knowledge, there haven't been other people who have followed up and done this also. But it is something for you to talk to your kids about because Facebook's for old people. If it had just stayed in the Facebook community, maybe your teens wouldn't know much about it. But it's gone to TikTok, which is the adolescent community and young adult community. And so I would say it would be worth bringing up to your kids
I'm gonna
as a
ask them
way
today
to talk to them about their feelings about suicide, their thoughts about it, and it's a good opportunity to say, have you ever thought about suicide? And they may get upset with you and say, oh, come on, no, I don't, but you need to set the tone. You need to say, no, this is something we can talk about. We should talk about drugs in our household, alcohol. We should talk about sex. We should talk about all behaviors, including our personal behavior, suicide. If you can't talk to Dad about it, then we need to fix that relationship.
I've been working on this kind of this view and this outlook on life, and it has to do with alcohol, sex, drugs, and religion. And my theory is talk to your kids about those things first before somebody else does. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because you want to be the one to introduce, to talk about those with them before somebody else does, who might not have the same outlook or their interest in heart. Does that make sense?
Oh, for sure. Or who just share very, very different values from what would be better for your child. I think a big part of talking to our kids is also listening to our kids. And so when I talk to parents about this, sometimes when we get sort of nervous as parents to have the talk, or, hey, Johnny, have you ever drank alcohol? Like those kinds of conversations are pretty awkward. And so I think we know what we want to say, and we have a tendency to then just lecture. And
this is what I know. This is what I've learned.
And they just sit there and tell. And you know what? You have some wisdom. You have some information that you do need to tell and share with your kid. But it's always more effective if it's a discussion. And don't be afraid to ask open-ended questions and listen. A little bit of silence can be very motivating to have a teenager talk. And my experience is most teenagers want to share their internal experiences. They want to talk about them, good or bad. But it sometimes takes a little prodding to get there. So yeah, have a talk with them about it. Maybe this unfortunate, traumatic Facebook suicide is a good opportunity to just say, hey, have you heard about this? Because I'm almost positive they'll say yes. And you can say, what do you think about that? Open-ended questions. Get the discussion rolling by listening at the beginning.
So what can we do as parents?
That's tough because, I think for people who heard Josh's story last week, we know that sometimes as parents you do what you can, what you think is right, and it's not enough. And so my heart goes out to Josh and all parents who've lost a child to suicide, who did try to pay attention to their child and connect with them and talk with them and did their best. So absolutely no blame or judgment. Sometimes there just isn't anything we can do. And I think one of the things about suicide research, and believe it or not, there's a lot of it, that's very frustrating, is that we can't always prevent suicide. We can't. However, we can dramatically decrease it and improve how our teenagers function by connecting with them. So one thing is, and I know this may seem sort of obvious, but one of the things parents say to me a lot is they're like, well, how do I know when it's just being a moody teenager and when it's serious? And I would say, well, if the mood continues to last for a long period of time, more than there's a change, like most teenagers, you were saying earlier, like up and down, good and bad, happy one day, sad the next. And that's probably within normal limits for most teens, right? But we also have to be aware of the fact that when there's a change in their mood, so if their ups and downs stop and it's just down for a while, that's a big red flag.
And as a parent, you notice these things.
Yeah, I think it has to do with withdrawal, stopping doing things that they normally would like to do. If they are turning down opportunities to hang out with friends, if they're not wanting to go to their music lessons or practices anymore, if they stay home from a family move, that's going out to the movies or a restaurant, whatever. These are big flags. But I think I mentioned this on the show last time. For teenagers and guys especially, but all teenagers, sometimes it's not sadness. Sometimes it's not obvious a depressed mood. Sometimes it's irritability. Agitation, absolutely. And that, for teenagers, might be just as good or better an indication that they're struggling than sadness, stay in bed, kind of feel weepy and stuff. And that can happen too. But don't dismiss irritability as no big deal, because that's actually highly correlated with depression in teenagers and boys especially.
I think it's probably best to err on the side of caution always.
Yeah. Oh, I think so. We don't want to overreact, but along
we don't
those
want to
lines,
underreact.
so we definitely don't want to underreact. So what do you do if your kid? Don't just have one conversation. In fact, I would just say right now, if you're listening to this and you're like, I don't think my kid has any of these problems, that's great. But there's something going on with your child, and you'll do them a favor and yourself a favor by opening up a more intimate dialogue with them. Have conversations with them. Well, how do you do that? Do you sit them down like a shrink and talk to them knee to knee? That's probably not going to work. But parallel play is pretty awesome. So think back to the old days where you got dad and son out side by side working on the bicycle in the garage. Having parallel time where you can talk and not stare each other down can be a great way to start some more meaningful conversations. Drives in the car, that's parallel, side by side, or doing dishes, or baking cookies, or doing something side by side.
Playing video games.
Even playing video games, absolutely. Doing something together with them where you kind of have this other activity going on helps decrease the pressure of them feeling like you're interrogating them.
Yeah.
So don't, just change how you talk to your kids. Open it up. Worst case scenario, you spend some great time with your kid, and that's not bad at all.
Mm-mm.
Best case scenario is you start to learn some things about them, and they themselves start to learn things about themselves as they talk about their thoughts and feelings and things that are going through. So if you have a concern about your child, please don't just have one conversation with them that's like, hey, are you suicidal? And they say no, and you're like, okay, good.
Did my part.
Maybe you need to have a bunch of change in how you talk. And here's another one. The research is starting to come back on this whole telemedicine thing that I've been doing since March. And I'll be honest, at first I was pretty skeptical. I didn't think that would be very effective with teenagers or kids. And the research is coming back to sort of validate the experience I'm having, and that is it's actually working pretty well. And part of that is because these people are already used to that technology.
They grew up in it. That's their norm.
We're the ones that are uncomfortable with the telemedicine.
Yeah, I've got to see their face. I want to be in the office. I want to see their mannerisms. But these kids are used to talking into cell phones and the video cameras and doing all this stuff and living. I get it 100%.
And in some ways, it might even be better for the younger set in some ways because it's more convenient to them. Mm-hmm. They don't have to, stop what they're doing, get in the car, take a 30-minute drive downtown, see the therapist, then drive. It's a 2-hour investment, and their whole days. Here I will have kids in their room telling me about like, hey, check this out, and here's the Lego I built, or a teenager who can sit on the deck and talk to you, and then go right back to hanging out with friends or doing things with their family. They're comfortable with it, and so parents, if you're concerned about your kid and you feel like they might need someone to talk to besides you, do not hesitate to start maybe some telemedicine therapy sessions. And where do you find out about those? Well, you want to get a referral if you can. Ask around. I'm sure somebody has a child going to a therapist, and you can get a referral from them. Or, your pediatrician, if you have a great relationship with them, they probably have therapists that they like to work with in town and share, support and patient information. So that can be another one. Another thing that I would say that's really important so parents should just to recap, let's pay attention to their mood. Irritability, especially, and agitation can be serious signs of depression. Change how you talk with your kids. Be more open-ended. Find parallel times to do activities with them.
Don't forget to listen.
Yeah, and be a very, very good listener. Another thing that I know is a hot-button topic here in Utah and around the country, and I don't really care anymore, so I'm just going to bring it up, and those are guns. I think we need to talk about the reality of having guns in your home. I'm not going to sit here and preach to you and say you shouldn't have a gun in your home. What I am going to say is that you have a serious responsibility if you have a gun in your home to keep it away from people that other than yourself.
You've got
all your kids, young adults, neighbor kids. You have a major responsibility to keep that away from them.
You've got a statistic that's
yeah, it's actually kind of. It's really surprising, sobering, yeah, and that is that when we look at suicide attempts that do not involve guns, so that can be anything else, but there's no gun involved in the suicide attempt, 94% of those fail, meaning suicide does not happen. That's a wonderful thing. That gives people a second chance to work through their depression, work through issues, and grow. And I've spoken to many people who have seriously attempted suicide, but they survived it.
We've had multiple on the show.
We've had multiple on the show, and it's great because that can be a total pivot point in their life. However, of all suicide attempts that do involve guns, 90% of those succeed or complete. That means 90% of people who use a gun in their suicide attempt, they die. So that's like a inverse correlation, right? We have 94% don't die if a gun is not involved, and 90% do die if a gun is involved. The lethality of a gun is tremendous and scary, and so we are experiencing that on the Facebook Live situation where a gun was used. And occasionally a person, there's that small 10%, we had one of those people on our show who shot themselves and didn't die, but that is
Casey.
Very rare. Yes, and we're grateful that he survived. So if you have a gun, as a parent, what can I do? Well, you can't always predict when a person, a child especially, is going to feel suicidal. Children, teenagers, young adults are much more impulsive than the rest of us old folks are. And in those dark moments, they may reach out for something that's very lethal and attempt suicide. If a gun's not available,
restrict the access.
They are much more likely to make it through that suicide attempt.
So we're talking gun safes, gun locks.
Yeah. Or even, I know this is a radical idea, take your gun safe with your guns in it over to Grandpa's house. Like, keep them over there so when it's hunting time or shooting with your friend's time or whatever you do, drive down the street and get them from Grandpa's house. There aren't any kids there. Still keep them in a gun safe, though. I really can't stress enough, if you can afford a gun, you need to also be able to afford an appropriate gun safe. And that don't be giving out access codes and things to anybody. I don't care if your kid's 18. I think you need to go say, I'll unlock that when we go hunting or shooting together. So I'm very serious about, when people say, what can we do? I know the gun topic, starts to get people all riled up, but the reality is you have a major responsibility, and the statistics are not in your favor if guns are available. And it might not just be your kid. It could be a neighbor kid. It could be a cousin. Lots of people, if they have access to those guns, that's very irresponsible. And so I highly recommend people, let's do what we can to keep kids safe.
And if you or someone you know needs to talk to someone, make sure you call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. They call 1-800-273-8255, 1-800-273-8255. Dr. Matt, thank you today for your information. You're a wealth of it, and I appreciate it. And we just want to get the conversation going, lessen the stigma about it, and get help where help is needed.
It's a wonderful time to, sometimes I feel like, national this month or that month is sort of silly, but not in this case. I think this is one of those things where everybody knows somebody that you could talk to about this, whether it's a friend, a sibling, or your own children. And so take this as an opportunity to learn how to talk about difficult things with the people you love.
Hey, Give somebody a hug today. You're listening to Project Recovery, a podcast about addiction. More importantly, it's about recovery. Project Recovery is a KSL podcast.
The contents of this program are for informational purposes only. The program is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician, licensed therapist, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you've heard on this program. KSL does not recommend or endorse any specific tests, physicians, products, procedures, opinions, or other information that may be mentioned on the program. Reliance on any information provided on the program is solely at your own risk.
It's the story of an American held in a dark Venezuelan prison.
Then all of a sudden they all kind of lined up. They pointed their guns at me. And this is the point where I thought, I'm going to die today.
I'm Becky Bruce. I spent a year working on Hope in Darkness, which now has more than 2 million downloads. Find it on kslpodcast.com or wherever you listen to podcasts.